This is Unfuck the Poor. I'm Joe Love, and for this episode, we're legally obligated. I'm legally obligated to tell you that just because we're talking about political violence in this episode does not mean that we condone it. However, understanding the role that violence plays in anti-fascist resistance is important to understanding how fascism falls. But violence is only one form of resistance. It just happens to be one of the most effective. So after the last episode, you might be concerned about the rising tide of fascism in America, and for that, I apologize. I didn't mean to be alarmist. Fascism is already here, so worrying about its creep in a daily life is futile. This is part of my campaign to get everyone to stop asking if this is fascism, or if it's a new kind of fascism, or if we need a new word for it. We do not. We know what it is. It's fascism. It's here, and we need to move on. As mentioned in the last episode, up until fascists finally seize power, all their energy is consumed by planning and recruitment, normalizing hatred and division from the fringes of society and working inward. At this point in American politics, the U.S. president is literally, at any given time, one cabinet member removed from leaders of alt-right, white supremacist, Christian nationalist, and fascist leaders domestically and internationally, who rose to prominence by decades of careful planning. Now, once fascists seize power, their strategy becomes one of reactionary violence. And violence in this context actually has several avenues. You can have judicial violence through legislation and stacked courts, rolling back protections and rights granted to vulnerable citizens and minorities. Financial violence through corruption, extortion, and market manipulation. Physical violence in the form of unchecked law enforcement or military action. Stochastic violence through inciting true believers into committing felonies against members of the opposition. And intellectual violence in the form of propaganda, book bans, and assaults on institutions. Fascists understand that even though their power is absolute, it is only temporary. That's why they move so fast, ignoring laws and violating the social contract so swiftly we barely have time to react. It's a blitzkrieg because they have a limited amount of time before the established order catches up to them via elections, lawsuits, and media scrutiny. It's through this lens that we must first understand that anti-fascism is the default state of democracy. Every safeguard put in place, judicial appointments, bureaucratic processes and government employees, legal precedents, elected officials, independent media, non-governmental organizations, all of those are de facto resistance to the tyranny that would suppress it all. And it all exists solely because it is allowed to exist. And the only way to eliminate those safeguards is to deny their existence, to establish them all as national security threats and impediments to prosperity. Before I go any further, and I don't do this often because it is lazy writing, I am going to repeat myself. All of those safeguards that are in place are only there because they are allowed to exist. In a democracy, more or less, we the people who pay taxes and vote for our corporate overlords allow this freedom of culture and expression that makes the kabuki theater of two-party politics seem legitimate. As long as we aren't fucked with too much, the masses will pretty much agree to whatever exploitation the government deems necessary. In an oligarchy, plutocracy, fascist uprising, those safeguards are in a much more precarious position. The safeguards that protect against tyranny are allowed to exist as long as tyranny isn't the end goal. A national constitution, the legal precedent for an entire judicial system, is not the fail-safe when dickheads take power. They will not allow democratic safeguards to stand. And those dickheads do not care how many red hats you bought. They will crush you if you get in the way. That's all very lofty, very political, very complicated, maybe divisive, but the anger of oppression is simple. One feels deeply the urge to fight, to resist. But how do you do it? If you were a bored, disaffected youth in the 1980s, you just punched a Nazi. You carried baseball bats and guarded little old ladies in their homes who had become the targets of white supremacist violence. This is a real thing that happened in Portland, Oregon. You shaved your head so you didn't have any hair to hold on to in a street fight. You went to punk shows, and in general, you just prevented Nazis from having a good time. However, if you were a European communist, social democrat, or Nazi in the 1920s or 30s, you would have found yourself as just one Spider-Man in a circle of Spider-Men, all pointing at each other, trying to figure out who exactly the fascist is. The German Communist Party, or KPD, was controlled and funded by the Soviet government and adhered to guidance set forth by Communist International, or Comintern, which is about what it sounds like, an international communist political movement. It was founded in Moscow in 1919 after the Socialist International fell apart during World War I. But then in 1928, Communist International took a sharp turn towards Stalinism and abandoned the United Workers' Front. They turned against Social Democrats and other workers' parties and the Nazis, all of which, according to Stalin, were fascist. Now, real quick, because you're probably wondering what the fuck I just said, because it sounded like I just said that Stalin thought that Social Democrats were fascist in the same way that Nazis were fascist, because yes, that's what I just said. You have to understand sort of some ancient communist mythology. The third period in communist mythology is essentially when the economy tanks and the workers are radicalized to revolution. Essentially, you have to have the third period in order for communism to be possible. And to Stalin, it looked like the third period was in fact happening right then. The economic stress of the time had caused a radical shift in sentiment towards the Nazi Party. Now, if you want to give it to him, you don't have to, but if you want to, Stalin wasn't totally wrong in this regard. The economic stress at the time had actually pushed a lot of Germans towards the Nazi Party. Unemployment in 1932 was at 30%. Germans were that frustrated middle class defined by Umberto Eco seeking salvation through fundamental change. Communist International declaring the start of the third period in 1928 then makes sense, because capitalism is about to come crashing down and the revolution at that point seemed inevitable. So the party began to purge its ranks of members that did not strictly adhere to the Communist Party guidelines coming out of the Soviet Union. And in 1928, those guidelines were being handed down by Josef Stalin, whose transformation of the Communist Party into a repressive totalitarian state, i.e. a fascist one, meant that anyone that did not strictly adhere to Stalin's interpretation and implementation of communism was, in fact, an enemy of communism, or a fascist. But Stalin was just a fascist, just like Hitler and a bunch of other people. What's interesting here is that a major feature of Stalin's 1928 third period reform was a shift towards socialism in one country instead of worldwide socialism, under the belief that it would be easier and more effective to achieve and maintain a socialist government within the USSR's borders. And in order to strengthen socialism in the USSR, the government had to be powerful enough to squash internal rebellion and conflict, hence the turn towards authoritarianism. See, we built these gulags for the good of the people. The features of Stalinism are the features that chill us in Orwell's 1984. Just thinking bad thoughts about the party was treason. Education, language, religion, science, even agriculture had to be repressed in order for the communist state to maintain control. Probably going to get a lot of hate from Stalinists and tankies on this one, but there is no alternate reality, not even this one that we share, where Stalinism was ever good for the people, as I am about to show. We have enough background on Communist International to show how ridiculous and dangerous the situation in Germany turned out. You have the sharp turn towards Stalinism, which means that the USSR had essentially turned inwards, isolationist, but was still influencing communist parties abroad. German communists were effectively told by Stalin in 1928, listen, we're focusing on the USSR, but this is what we believe now. Social Democrats are now fascists because they participate in class collaboration. And if your revolution ever works out, we will purge all party members who collaborate with these fascists. That's effectively what he said. I couldn't find the real quote. But this wasn't new. After Stalin came to lead the Communist Party after Vladimir Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin stated in a speech, quote, "Social democracy is objectively the moderate wing of fascism," end quote. Well, what the fuck is social democracy? Let's go back to Mussolini. Social democracy is another word for class collaboration. What the fuck does that mean? That not only preserves the artificial hierarchy of societal structure, but it champions and encourages citizens to accept their place in society and effectively behave, stay in line. If you recall from that first episode, fascism requires hierarchy and subordination, with each social class looking down on the class below it. And sure, that's all well and good, except that Stalinism is just another form of class collaboration, except there's only two classes. the proletariat, and the party. And the party is embodied by the man with the giant mustache. Stalin's embrace of the cult of personality reminded Soviets that the party ruled above all. Stalin put his stupid fucking face on everything. Take a quick mental journey with me. You are a German communist in 1928, and you have just received word from Communist International that the Social Democratic Party of Germany, whom you've been kind of collaborating with in a begrudged kind of solidarity, is now the enemy. They are social fascists, which is a whole new-ass thing that you hadn't heard of before. The Social Democratic Party of Germany was a coalition of what we would call establishment politics, a combination of social democrats who wanted equitable reform, along with conservatives and liberals. You could say that the SDP, Social Democratic Party, was basically the status quo party. Even though the Nazi Party wanted to completely overhaul the German government and eliminate the Weimar Republic's liberal democracy, the Nazis were still just relatively small, gaining only 2.8% of the vote in 1928 elections. So the Communist International, looking at the size of the Nazi Party compared to the Social Democrat Party, decided that the Nazi Party wasn't really a threat at all. The German Communist Party, or KDP, would go on to call themselves literally the only anti-fascist party in Germany. Now, you might be wondering how an obviously fascist party like the Stalinist-aligned KDP could call Social Democrats and Nazis fascist in the same sentence. I mean, sure, technically, if anything to the right of communism, it doesn't make it fascist. It turns out that everybody was just calling everybody else a fascist. George Orwell wrote in the Tribune in 1944, quote, "Almost any English person would accept bully as a synonym for fascist. That is about as near to a definition as this much abused word has come," end quote. Now, it turns out that using the term fascist to describe your enemy is actually just Stalinist-style newspeak. Stalin looked at the rise of literal fascists under Mussolini and then looked at how Germany seemed to be copying the same model. Not just in fun uniforms, military parades, and obnoxious leaders, but also in the alignment of state and corporate interests. From the USSR's perspective, fascism seemed the obvious end stage of capitalism. Corporations would eventually come to rule over the people, and the government would be so in name only. It is at least understandable that from the communist workers' perspective, all forms of non-socialist, non-communist governance led down this road to fascism, and so fascism was used derogatorily by Stalin to describe everyone to the right of communism. It then also makes sense, from the perspective of the Social Democrat Party, that you would look at the models of strict governance within the Communist and Nazi parties, along with their reliance on strongman leaders, as being one and the same. The establishment party could not be fascist because they simply wanted to maintain a liberal democracy. It also makes sense from a Nazi perspective that fascist was not an insult. Hitler made comments to the effect that fascist Italy and Nazi Germany were kindred spirits, though Hitler, because he was an asshole, thought that Nazism was a superior form of fascism due to its strict racial distinctions. For Hitler to call another party fascist would have been a compliment. So considering that Germany had communists, Nazis, and the establishment parties all vying for control of the country, you might be surprised to learn that the 1920s and 30s in Germany was a period of relative peace. Oh, what the fuck is that? The German Freikorps was a right-wing paramilitary group that was mostly World War I veterans, and they were used by the Weimar Republic to suppress civil unrest. And between January 5th and January 12th, 1919, the German Freikorps fought a rebellion against Germany's Communist Party, the Spartacus League, and the Independent Social Democratic Party, resulting in over 200 deaths, mostly communists. Now, this is what would later become known as the Spartacist Uprising in Berlin. The Provisional Weimar government won, but the Spartacist Uprising ushered in a decade of political violence and bloodshed. In just March of 1919, just a couple months later, 1,200 strikers in Berlin were killed by the Freikorps when a general strike turned violent. In May of 1919, a Soviet uprising in Munich resulted in the deaths of 600 at the hands of the Freikorps. In March 1920, an attempted coup by Wolfgang Kapp was laughably foiled, but was followed by the Ruhr uprising, in which 50,000 armed workers, taking advantage of Kapp's distraction, took control of Ruhr's industrial district, resulting in more fighting with the Freikorps that resulted in, again, over 1,200 dead. In 1921, former Minister of Finance Matthias Erzberger was assassinated by ultranationalists, and in 1922, that same group of assassins murdered Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau. Then there was, of course, Hitler's failed beer hall putsch in 1923. The Weimar Republic's establishment party was under attack from the far left and the far right, and the SDP's willingness to use state violence against citizens resulted in organized paramilitary groups willing to match that violence of the state, both to defend themselves and to attempt to overthrow the Republic. Hitler and the Nazis had the Sturmabteilung, the SA founded in 1921, and the Communists had the Roter Front Kampfverbund, the alliance of Red Front fighters, formed in 1924. The Red Front fighting units were located in working-class industrial cities and seaports made up of armed workers ready to mobilize against German police and Nazis when demonstrations turned violent. Despite the sharp turn under Stalin in 1928, by the time the Red Front fighters were banned in May 1929, right after the May Day Revolt, 70% of its 130,000 members were not affiliated with the German Communist Party. The Red Front was also one of the first groups targeted by Nazis once Hitler became chancellor. As the Nazi Party grew in popularity and Hitler's SA was encouraged to fight and escalate, street violence between the SA, German police, and the Red Front became near daily occurrences. Solidarity matters. The Red Front was more than just a paramilitary organization. When Red Front members were arrested, the organization Red Help stepped in to cover legal fees for prisoners and provide assistance to families while fighters were in prison. Following a riot and street violence at the 1929 May Day rally in Berlin that left 33 communists and civilians dead at the hands of the police, the governing Social Democrats declared the Red Front an extremist group and banned them outright. Again, solidarity matters. In just 3 years, the popularity of the Nazi Party skyrocketed from a dismal election turnout of 2.8% in 1928 to a massive 37.3% turnout by July 1932. Fascism moves swiftly, and trying to play catch-up, the strict Stalinist agenda from 1928 was abandoned as the KDP realized that Nazism was a far greater threat to Germany than the establishment party. In 1932, the KDP, German Communist Party, formed an alliance with socialists to create Antifaschistische Aktion. Well, in theory they formed an alliance. Antifaschistische Aktion was still very much communist-controlled, and because of the animosity between the two groups, they were pretty much allied on paper alone. And it's a shame, because the Social Democrats actually also had their own anti-fascist organization, the Iron Front, and despite being equally opposed to a Nazi takeover, they were also anti-communist. Again, solidarity matters. The refusal to unite prior to Hitler seizing power would be disastrous for the Communists and Social Democrats. In 1932, German institutional safeguards were overridden using state emergency powers to overthrow Prussia's democratically elected government, replacing leaders with a Nazi commissioner. Just a few months later, Hitler would use this same strategy to consolidate powers as the Führer. Antifaschistische Aktion was formed too late in response to the Nazi takeover. May 1932, and less than a year later, March 23, 1933, Hitler would propose the Enabling Act, and a day later, March 24, the Reichstag would pass it with a huge majority vote, giving Hitler decree powers, cementing his role as dictator. In addition to moving too slowly, the Communist Party's rift with the Social Democrats kept a unified defensive force from forming. The Iron Front and Antifaschistische Aktion should have been able to work together to resist the Nazi surge, but years of fighting each other in the streets left the parties unwilling to cooperate despite being publicly aligned. Antifa as a strategy was born in the interim period between World Wars I and II, when ideologically opposed groups attempted to fill the power vacuum left behind after Germany's defeat in World War I. Political violence was not a byproduct, it was a tool used by all parties to establish control. As a concept, anti-fascism had two fundamentally different definitions. To the communists, the alignment of corporate interests with state power, demonstrated by the Italian Fascist Party, the Nazi Party, and the Social Democrats, was a clear ideological distinction. To the Social Democrats, ceding all power to a singular party led by a strongman was more of an amorphous methodological distinction. The Communist, Nazi, and Italian Fascist parties may have had fundamentally different beliefs, but their approach to power and governance was the same. Around the world, leading up to World War II, all the nuances between ideological and methodological differences between fascism would get dropped, and the concept would become generalized and, as Orwell noted, overused and abused, and confused. Fascism essentially became any instance of oppression, and anti-fascism was the general term for resistance. This worked really well in the United States, where European alliances and political strife were far removed from daily life. Fascism was just a force sweeping east and west across Europe, an easily identifiable enemy in a landscape of convoluted crisscrossing beliefs. Wherever fascists crossed a border, the enemy of our enemy became our friend. For the United States and the USSR, this united front against European fascism would dissolve after World War II, and the same black and white mentality that targeted fascism in the 40s was repurposed to target communism in the 1950s. As for the original capital A Antifa, Antifaschistische Aktion did not just disappear once Hitler took control. Having outed themselves as a militarized resistance to the Nazis, members of the Communist Party and workers who had joined the resistance were among the first prisoners to be placed in concentration camps. German Communist Party members who were not imprisoned or executed either fled Germany, joined the Nazi Party, or continued the work of anti-fascist resistance in secret. Moving slowly, public visibility, and an unwillingness to create a unified front were all hard-won lessons that modern anti-fascist movements would learn from. Fascists, on the other hand, learned that anti-fascism was an obstacle best overcome early. That division between social classes and political beliefs could be exploited to prevent cohesion, and that chaos and uncertainty create the conditions necessary to seize power. So, yeah, there was capital A anti-fascism in Germany in the 1930s, Antifaschistische Aktion, but lowercase Antifa lives on.